Welcome to VidDevo Podcast. Now, I don't know if you know anything about me, and I hope not, because if you know too much, well, that's not a good thing. Or maybe it is, or maybe it isn't. Well, you'll figure that one out. But VidDevo, you might have heard of. If you haven't, well, you could go on the internet and look up VidDevo, and there you'll find VidDevo. Now, podcasts are kind of new to me, where they're old school for some of you. But for me, old school would be something like cassettes, an 8-track. Although 8-tracks, maybe not, that's way too old school. That would be ancient school. Cassettes are what I grew up on. And this particular series that we're doing right now is called VidDevo Podcast because it's VidDevo Podcast 50. And that series 50 is about 50 years that I've been a Jesus freak. Well, let's be clear. God never made any freaks. He may have made them freakish, but not freaks. Because, frankly, God's creation, whether it be an aberration of his intention or whether it be the beauty and the magnificence of his ability to create in sin something wonderful, I think is pretty magnificent. So a Jesus freak would be technically a Jesus masterpiece in some ways. So I've been around for, I don't know, about 67 years now, my wife tells me, and I'm getting ready to, this August, be 68 years. I'm getting old, and I've seen some things, I've heard some things, I've handled some things with my own hands. Now that's a paraphrase of a scripture that says, that which we have seen, that which we have heard, that which we've handled with our own hands pertaining to the word of life. And that particular scripture is sort of introduction to what we're doing and talking about right now and why we're doing 50 years as a Jesus freak, or 50 years memoirs of a Jesus freak. Because I'm writing a book. My book is called Paradox. And Paradox really sums up in one word, what God has done in me, what God has done through me, what God has done to me, what God is, in my own opinion, and a lot of what Christianity technically is, and Judaism, or Judaism in the sense of Judaism with the Messiah, not without the Messiah, because Judaism without the Messiah is just another religion, but Judaism with Messiah in it, is a paradox, because there's so many what seemingly appear to be contradictions that God makes into perfect unity. I mean, really, if you just looked at the overall big picture, you'd say, wow, that's perfect. How can a sinner be saved? How can the imperfect become perfect? How can there be a God of love that kills people? I mean, does God kill people? Well, you might want to look back in the Old Testament. It gets a little strange there with the 5 tribes, going into, Canaan and wiping them out. So what a lot of people have criticism about when it comes to contradictions about people who call themselves or are called Christians, they got legitimate gripes. They got legitimate stories. They got legitimate reason to say that doesn't make sense. That's why I called my memoir Paradox. It's called, the book I'm writing is called Paradox, 50 Years Memoir of a Jesus Freak by Michael James Stone. That's me. And I've been around for a while, and I've done some things in my life of faith that are both positive, negative, and questionable in between. And those things are that with which I have seen, heard, and handled with my own hands, meaning that I am a witness of those things. I have factually not only seen them, but re-examined them in the light of a court of law, my own, to wonder why did I go through that, or what was the purpose, or what's the design in all of this. And that's what this introduction is about. There is design, there is purpose, there is meaning to your life as well as mine. There is a grander scale of all that is occurring in not only your life and where you live and what you do and the people you interact with, being like the salt or the light or however you want to look at it, or a planting of the Lord, but there's also an intricacy of the minutiae that God goes all the way down to every individual, even breath that you take. If God has said every hair on your head is counted, then literally the minutiae, everything tiny, everything down to the microscopic and subatomic level, God knows. God is involved in. Now, some of you don't even believe in God, which is fine. When you watch this or hear this or you do this, hey, I don't blame you. I didn't believe in God either. Matter of fact, I still kind of I believe in God, or I believe in God. No, I don't have a choice. Let's put it this way. It's not that I believe in God. It's just that God intervenes in my life. I don't have a choice. It's like, how do you get around the sun shining? You can walk outside and say the sun ain't shining. And if it is, that's an interesting perspective. There are people right now that are into disinformation, misinformation, lying, telling fables, telling stories, telling inaccuracies, and calling it whatever they call it, whether they call it politics, whether they call it political maneuvering, whether they call it religion, whether they call it science. Science has got its own lies or its own fabrications in it. When you start thinking about quantum theories or quantum mechanics versus, all these other ideas of quantum universe and then multiverse and all this stuff, those are all based on a fallacy. They really are. They're not necessarily true. They're true according to what the person thinks they are, but not according to what reality is. As far as proving it, good luck. You should be able to see as you delve into some of these mathematical equations that maybe it doesn't quite apply the way you're told it applies. And I'll give you an example of that. And that's why this book that I'm writing about my life of 50 years as a born-again Christian, meaning a Jesus freak, is that, what was I going to say? Who knows? Anyways, but the point is that these ideas that people have in quantum mechanics and time management and time and the way they look at time, it's always interesting to me because when you consider time, right now I'm recording this on Easter. Well, Easter, according to what people are saying, is Easter. Now, it just so happens that it's a month away from Passover this year. It's March 20-something. I don't know what even it is, to be honest with you right now. I don't keep track of dates anymore. But it's rainy outside. The weather isn't quite like what it would be for Easter. It's kind of like, this isn't just climate change. This is really early for Easter. So Easter is supposed to be Good Friday. There's 7 days, Passion Week. That all comes during Passover, the Jewish holiday. Oh, really? Yeah, they two fit together, kind of cohesive. But you see, when you get in the West, they kind of invented it in a different way with the Catholic Church, and then with all these guys trying to say, hey, we're going to pick it the Paschal moon, and then we're going to say that it's the weekend after the Paschal moon, which is the full moon after the, spring equinox and all these things. We're going to do it this way. What if God said, I'm going to roll back the sun, maybe a couple of hours? What does that do to your time frame situation? As a matter of fact, because God did roll back time a couple of times in the Old Testament, I wonder how that works into some of these quantum physics and quantum mechanics ideas that people have. Because we don't actually apply science sometimes to the Bible, and we don't actually apply the Bible to science, kind of make these two warring each other. They don't. They complement each other, but they only apply to a certain principle. And I had to, when I was studying religion later on in life, when I first got saved, I wasn't studying religion. I was kind of trying to figure out what the hell happened to me. That's why this book is being written, Paradox. Because I was like, what was that? This amazing feeling that I had. And that's what was about the Jesus movement, was that it was more about feeling than it was about faith or about facts. It was a lot of what we experienced with this emotional roller coaster ride called the Holy Spirit. or called getting saved, technically, being born again of the Spirit, because all of a sudden we were like looking for love, boom, found love, wow, and then boom, going into what? I mean, a lot of Jesus freaks became yuppies, and then they kind of went into the world and kind of got sidetracked, I think. But we'll talk about that in these 50 tapes. 50 podcasts. This isn't the first one. This is an introduction to it. This is kind of what you have to look forward to. This is kind of like an overview of what you get to find out about. And then, like, we were all talking about Jesus is coming, and then you kind of look at, well, the Jesus Revolution movie was kind of interesting. I mean, I like it because it was about Greg, and Kathy, and, I know Greg and Kathy, I mean, I didn't know them personally real well, but, I got saved at Greg's church, in the early days, and Calvary Riverside, and I didn't see Lonnie. I didn't meet Lonnie, but I knew about Lonnie, and a lot of the people that were involved in the Jesus movement, yeah, I pretty much know them, I've met them, and kind of much set up chairs for them, or, I was like behind the scenes helping with things, so I can talk about what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I'd handled with my own hands. But it wasn't quite like the Jesus Revolution movie. It's kind of like enjoyable. I mean, it's a good movie, don't get me wrong. But it wasn't about the Jesus movement. So if you're looking for the Jesus movement, you really want to look at some other things too. More documentaries than, kind of a great, beautiful, wonderful, cute little picture with Chuck, Kelsey playing Chuck, and kind of like, interesting. So, and I know Chuck, I met Chuck, and we visited, and blah, blah, blah. And so I went to church for a couple years, so it's pretty cool. But when we talk about these things, then you have to kind of put a handle on what is reality as opposed to what quote unquote called the facts at the time, because even science over the years keeps changing the idea what even atoms are made out of. Well, there used to be this atomic glue that, held the atoms together. They couldn't find the glue, but they believed in the atomic glue, and then they came up with other things, and they keep coming up with all these different theories about what's holding atoms together. God says he is, but, whether you accept that or not is kind of like, well, if you accept science, then it'd be easier to believe in God than it is to believe in science, because science can't come up with the fact of it. They can come up with the theory of it, but not the fact of it. And people forget that these quantum ideas, anything with the Q in front of it, is a theory. It's not a provable yet science. And they even talk about, like, Light and Einstein, all these people, and I'm going, well, aren't we talking about observable means rather than created means? I mean, I would talk to a creator if I was talking about created things, because if somebody who created things created it, wouldn't he be able to tell us how he created and what he did, why and everything else? So I'm a little weird because I was always going back to the source rather than trying to prove the source. I didn't have to approve God. God had to approve me. You see, that's why it's called paradox, because everything in my life is a paradox. I mean, even my name, Michael, is a question mark. So when I got saved in 1974, I questioned everything, and I also stayed far, far away from all these different people that were Jesus freaks, Jesus people. They were legitimately, beautiful, but they also had funny things they were saying out of their mouth. Like the guy that took me to the concert that I got saved in, he kept talking about this like speaking in tongues. He kept saying, man, I just want to speak in tongues. I just want to speak in tongues. I'm going, what? It's like, so I didn't ask him what, but, at the time I was thinking, that's weird. What's that mean? So I just kind of went along with it, until I, actually went forward at a service. And when I went forward, they didn't have us stand up in front of all the people, and confess this or say that or sinner's prayer or all that. No, they dragged my butt in the back room, and prayed for me. I was like, what? Well, from the top of my head to the tip of my toes and all the way back and up through my nose. There it goes. The Holy Spirit went, boom, you're saved. I went, ah! And wow. I went from 1 minute, this sad example of a human being in some ways. I mean, boy, my mother, oh my God, my mother was the other woman, and I knew that when I was in elementary school. My sisters never found out until they were adults. My mother never married my stepdad, which was their father, which, my mother didn't even tell us we were half sisters or half brothers. Because back in those days, we all looked the same. So guess what? We didn't think of it that way. We just thought we were all one happy family. Facts got in the way later. And then DNA kind of came along. It's like, wow, good thing they didn't start checking that back then. So my mother, being the other woman, made it an interesting situation for me growing up. And my childhood was an interesting one because it wasn't so bad, but it wasn't so good, but it was kind of like mixture. So by the time I got saved, it was like, whew, I found out what love is. I was like, kaboom! This explosion of emotion was so overwhelming. I had never felt anything like that before. I mean, I had one of the great, and they don't have that many of them recorded, that people are out there, telling them about, because it was like we were trying to push everybody into, like, study the Bible, learn faith, fact, feeling, feeling is last. No one, baby. In the Jesus movement, everybody was after the feeling. They wanted these gifts, they wanted this, that, and the other thing. Well, I didn't know what those things were, but I did know what the feeling was, and it didn't go away. And Amy Grant wrote a song called 1974 that says, and the feeling lived among us anyways. It's like we didn't know what we were doing, but it happened. We're a bunch of hippies running around, like seeking the latest high, the latest, feeling, the latest experience, the latest emotional, thing. Because, you got to remember the times. Kennedy's and Martin Luther King and people dying and Vietnam going on or ending, and we got beaten. People hated war, and so they hated the people that went to war. That was embarrassing, wasn't it, huh? Gee, I think we did that 2 or 3 times since then. Afghanistan? Yeah, okay. Yeah, that was a marvelous, wonderful idea. So, all that I'm saying in this introduction is that there is more to reality than just what you think of as facts, or that you think of as true, or that you think of as information, or that you are interpreting. God is real. And I can't deny it. When God talks to you, you listen. Like E.F. Hutton, that commercial that used to be out there. It's like, when E.F. Hutton speaks, everybody listens. And I don't even know if E.F. Hutton's even in business today. But when God intervenes in your life, it's kind of like, I'm glad emotionally I got saved the way I did, because on the one hand, there's no explanation for it. There is no explanation. 1 minute, these guys are kind of like, they put their hands on my shoulders, what'd they have, electricity in their fingers or something? And then all of a sudden, like, I'm feeling hollow inside, and I feel this thing come pouring through me, coming to, like, top of my head. It was even, like, to the tips of my hairs, at the very tip, went, shoom, down, and kind of went, all fulfilling. I was like, whew, I felt like a water balloon being blown up, or a balloon being blown up, and suddenly I was like, and my eyes, when I opened my eyes, I could see. When my hearing was different. I had knowledge. There was no way I should have had some of the knowledge that I had in those days. Now, did I know everything about the Bible? No, I didn't know everything about the Bible. I just knew a lot of things. All of a sudden I was like, some people would have said saving grace or something. I don't know, but supernatural knowledge, word of wisdom, word of knowledge. I didn't really have word of wisdom, word of knowledge yet. That came later, 40 days to the exact day, believe it or not. And then 40 days later, I'm at some, cute little Bible study in somebody's home, and boom, somebody prayed. We were sitting around a circle, holding hands. All of a sudden, 2 hours later, I'm kind of like back to my senses, and I'm sitting there in a chair, barely can't get out of the chair, and I'm speaking in tongues. What the hell was that? That's the way I felt, but at the same time, I knew what it was. I had a word of knowledge at the time, like, but I was speaking in tongues. And then from that moment on, I was like, wow, boy. And then my life went to hell. Really. Wasn't long after that I was in the Marine Corps. Wasn't long after that I was dying from Crohn's disease. Wasn't long after that I was in the hospital, fighting for my life. Wow. What kind of life is that for a Jesus freak? Saved by emotion. Saved later by devotion. Saved by what? Well, God had a plan. That's why it's such a contradiction. On the one hand, wow, this guy is like Superman of the Jesus freaks, Not really, but, it felt like it. As far as gifts are concerned, boy, I would like to think what I didn't have at the time, because it's still kind of like, we'll talk about that in these podcasts, VidDevo podcasts, about all the gifts and all the different things and what you call, the certain number of them is like, I think you got a limitation there. God ain't limited. It's limitless. So, you may want to reconsider some of your theology. And that's one of the things that I had to do later in life, was that as I began to kind of put into practical knowledge of religion, meaning Christianity and the Jesus movement, and, going to churches and being a missionary and being a preacher, eventually became a preacher, a VidDevo preacher, that most people would say teacher, but I'd say, no, I wasn't a teacher, because I know what a teacher really is, and it ain't what that people's out there doing. There are some teachers out there, women and men, but most of them are preaching, because they stand up in front of a congregation and they preach. If you tell me they're teaching, I'd say, well, where's the one-on-one, or where's the 1-on-10 or 10-on-1 or whatever, but they're not preaching or teaching because they're not interactive enough, Now, some of them are, don't get me wrong. Some of them have the format down. They kind of go that part, and they add more to become a teaching ministry type. But most of the time, what you're looking at on a Sunday morning is you're looking at preaching, not teaching. Otherwise, you'd go to school and say, well, is the teacher preaching or teaching? That's true. Some teachers are preachers, figure that one out. There's that word, paradox, contradiction. So one of the things about being around these 50 years is, frankly, I don't give a damn. Excuse me. I care, I love, I have these feelings that I'm supposed to have, and at the same time, I have the reality of what I know I am in the flesh, is that, hey, I'd just as soon be happy if God nuked them all and, or if we nuked them all and God sorted them out. It's like, hey, it's a whole lot better than what we're doing. Really, because I can look at having come from the mountaintop, going down into the valley and gone, boom. And I don't see the world as coming to a better conclusion of its time on earth, but rather the ending of ages is showing me that, hey, if we're talking about like what the word is they use called times of the Gentiles, I don't see them doing much better than the Jews did during the time of the Jews, being in charge, so to speak. Yous lose, Jews, and I'm Jewish. Oy, hey, such a deal. So, what are we doing? Well, with the VidDevo podcast, we're trying to address the modern man, woman, child, LGBTQA, whatever person, anybody, whatever you want to call yourself. You're a human being, whether you know it or not. You're not an alligator mixed in blood or whatever. You're not a fallacy, but you're in part of a master design that is occurring whether you like it or not. And God exists whether you want him to or not. So there you go. You could either be, like recognizing the design and the purpose or not. And it doesn't matter, because whether you recognize it or not, you're not that important to it happening, because it happens anyways, whether you think you're important or not. Now, as far as what some people will tell you, faith-wise, God loves you. Well, yeah, but he just as easily send you to hell if you don't get your together, bluntly. So yes, God, to say my Father, God the Father, or my Father, will love you even after you go to hell. God is love. If you want to figure it out, then really the type of love that we experience is very sad and very shallow and very menial or prevenial or whatever, you want to use some Latin term, venial. But if you want to get into the real nitty gritty, this is an all-encompassing type of word that goes far beyond the little, like phileo, stergio, agape, agapeo, and, all the other Greek words we try to say, well, these mean this, that mean that, mother's love, father's love, daddy's love, children's love, love between two females, love between two men, whatever. I don't care. That ain't God. God is love. God is the fulfillment and embodiment completely of love. Any part that you have is a tiny part of God. tiny. I mean, sometimes it's minuscule. You got to have the Holy Spirit to kind of like fill it up, blow it up, make it real, make it all encompassing in your soul. Because without being born again of the Spirit, you just got a soul and a body. You ain't got no spirit inside you. I mean, come on, you already know that. You figure that one out. That ain't no like rocket science statement. You already know that, and you do know that. I mean, bluntly. You're not going to come around and say, well, I'm a spiritual being. I've been light and dark and, and you may come out of some cult and say that, but, you already know that, it didn't work quite the way you're talking about. And I'm going, yeah, I know. God is love. They'll tell you that, this is love, a type of love, in some other way they describe, some being that they want to make into a God, but they don't come out with just an all statement, boom, God is love. So when it comes to demonstrating that, well, then there's Jesus. And that's what's so amazing about being a Jesus freak is that you know the difference between the Father and the Son. There is a difference. Now, we like to, in religion, say, okay, they're all triangular, this beautiful triangle of like equal and the same and the same and equal and, this is that and not that and bull. Jesus said, I'm not God, well, he says if you see me, you've seen the Father. But he makes it an interesting way of saying it, doesn't he? He doesn't say, I'm God, That would be sacrilegious. He says, I am. Now, that's what's interesting is there something more to there being Jesus is God and Jesus isn't God? You see, Jesus would not say, I am God. He would say, I am. And sure enough, you'd fall down probably like they did in the New Testament. Kind of like, what? Boom! Collapse. Because there is something more we don't know than we do know. And what we do know, we try to pretend like we know because we add our own interpretation of what we say we know, of what we pretend that God has revealed to us when God hasn't said. He said, you don't know me. My thoughts are above your thoughts. My ways are above your ways. You're as high as the heavens are. So the Father, the Son, the Spirit, yes, we say one. Yes, I agree. It's echad. But that's a multiple one. That's a Jewish one. American ones are like 1, 2, 3, 1. So they go like, this is one, but there's 3. Now that's a Western culture kind of thing. If you say one in Jewish culture, one is one is one. Echad is echad is echad. Now maybe like, there may be 3 parts in there somewhere or 3 people or whatever, you'll kind of want to mix it all up and get crazy, 7, 3, 1, You could do that because the Spirit says, how many parts of the Spirit are there? Well, that's a good question. Is it one personage? Western culture gets into these really weirds. Now, don't get me wrong. Jewish culture, wow! Do we come up with some really weird, wacko, wonderful in some ways, spiritual kind of like, and I don't mean just Kabbalah, I mean like really sage wisdom stuff from the ancients talking about God and what they believe God is. So it's kind of interesting, in Jewish culture, because you go 7, 3, 1, and still 1, but in American culture, we go 3, 1, so kind of like, play with it. So there's a paradox there. There's something we don't understand, but it contradicts, but it doesn't contradict. So there's 1, yes, 3, yeah, well, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So you can accept that or not. Doesn't matter because you're going to deal with somebody, and who you're dealing with is Jesus. Because you try to deal with God, you're going to get into some real scary parts. I finally, when I was a Jesus freak, I one day said, Lord, I don't understand how come people are afraid of you. It's like, why are people afraid of God? What's this fear of God? I don't get this fear of God. I don't think God should be feared. Blah, blah. God took care of that. I know what the fear of God is. Okay, Moses, you are one badass dude. Because ain't no way I'm going to deal with God on that level. No, I dealt with the Father, and he revealed himself in a way. There is no doubt that's God. And it's like, whoa, okay, never again. And you'll find out about that, in maybe the book, but I doubt it, but probably in the podcast, because I'll probably get into it one night, day, sometime. So this overview is meant to cover a lot of just kind of teaser, feeling, emotional, kind of like, hey, check it out, Now, the other parts that I should talk about, that you want to know about that are contradictory or paradoxes is, hey, I've been married 3 times. What? Oh my God. Or is that, oh my woman? So, is there contradiction? Well, yeah. Is there paradox? Yeah. Did it change me? Yeah, well, marriage will change you, definitely. I like to say it this way. Marriage is best left in the hands of someone who's experienced one. My wife that I am married to now for over 10, 12, 15 years, I forget how many years we've been married, a long time, is saved. We're never divorcing, we're not divorcing. We don't have a problem with that. We're going to die old, and whatever, we're old already. So, it's not a far cry from dying. A lot of people say, well, I might get raptured instead. Good luck, maybe. So, bottom line is that sinners are each and every human being that can't say, I'm Jesus. And I don't mean Jesus in the contemporary word usage, but I mean, if you aren't Jesus himself, the Son of God, you aren't able to say you're not a sinner. You sin one way or another. You're not perfect. In other words, and God, in the way that God accounts and accrues perfection in his way of looking, Jesus was perfect. Don't get me wrong, there's some things that Jesus kind of like went, according to this, they weren't so perfect, but they were like, contradictory. Well, that's a paradox. The paradoxes are the ones that where religious people in the West try to answer the questions by using Western thought instead of Eastern thought. And even Eastern thought went, okay, well, yeah, I guess you could say that because then because Eastern will rationalize it to a point where they'll say, yeah, that is perfection, but they'll rationalize it to a point of perfection. So, question that. So, the paradox of me being married more than once would totally wipe out a lot of the people that, frankly, at the time of my salvation, or when I got saved, or when I got, the process of salvation began in me, and that God is saving me. And to this day, I say we aren't saved yet. We are saved when we are changed, from this corruption to incorruption, and this corruption puts on incorruption. But yes, we're being redeemed. We've already been chosen. God chose us, and so now we're, bingo. You could say, well, I'm confident in my salvation. I have this, assurance of salvation. Well, that's a Western thought too, but it's like, the assurance of salvation is, if we can, for this is the record that God hath given to us eternal life, and this life is in the Son. He who hath the Son hath life. He who hath not the Son, God hath not life. Well, that's nice, but that's not really an assurance of salvation. That's assurance of future salvation to come, but it is the assurance of salvation. The real assurance of salvation is when you're dead and you rise and you're there and you're saved, because it's saved. You're saved from death. Right now death is still working. It's in our members, so we're technically already been bought with a price and all that stuff for you religious people. But when I was still pre-Jesus, Time Magazine said God is dead, and theologians said God is dead. And they were coming up with this idea that, hey, you know what? Maybe we blew it. Maybe we screwed up. Maybe we don't got it right. Some of them. Wow. Think about that for a while. Here they are, 1,500 years or 1,960 years, more or less. And it only took less than 2,000 years before they started denying that God exists or that God died, and that. Sure, they used it as an example of the church disappearing and all this religion going bye-bye and all that stuff. But what did God do at that time? Some people say the Jesus movement, is like boom, boom, and it started in the 60s, and kept going on until roughly, end of the 70s somewhat. From a Jewish culture, you might want to look at that a little differently, because it's like the Jesus movement kind of happened around the world, but what was the time frame of all this stuff happening was that people would like to talk about former and latter rain. Well, I'll tell you about the former rain and the latter rain. The latter rain is the Jesus movement, but it started in the 1800s, literally with like Pentecostal movement, happening at the same time that Jews started to go back to, quote, Palestine, to the land of Israel, and started buying property and cultivating the swamps. That was, believe it or not, at the turn of the century. The turn of the century, I would say to you, starting with Jews, not Gentiles, is when, in fact, the latter rain began. Now, that wasn't the actual fulfillment of, the Jesus movement or the beginning of it, but the Jesus movement to the Gentiles is kind of coming at the end of the age. It's like, yeah, Jesus movement was in the 60s, but look back and see what was going on in Israel all that time. You may find that the Holy Spirit was moving among the Jews, doing some phenomenal things and setting things up for the Jesus movement. So, the podcast 50 is going to have lots of interesting perspectives, details, facts, realities that you might not be aware of, because how many people are going to tell you that Israel became a nation in the turn of the century, 1800s? Why were there these guys, like Clarence Larkin, detailing the end of the world in the 1800s, projecting all the way to the end of the 1900s? How did people like Sir Isaac Newton, come up with the idea that Jesus would return in, say, 2060? I think it's 2060, if I remember right. These guys were predate before Jesus movement. These guys were old, but what did they do? And how come Jewish culture has this certain perspective of all these sages saying certain things about Messiah, Moshiach to come, the Jesus that's coming, the Jesus that came? They kind of knew about Jesus? What's up with that? I thought they didn't believe, So podcasts are going to be fun in the sense I get to play with all of this. Preaching, really, is what it is. They're VidDevo because I've been doing VidDevo. There's about 5,000 videos out there, that are called VidDevo. They might be called devotional, but, close enough. But they're VidDevos, and they're similar to this. They might have some intro and they might have some other stuff, going on, reading and scriptures and stuff. But podcasts, I just get to talk, It's like podcasts are like, hey, we're talking these topics. We're pods, so to speak. Anyway, podcasts aren't any different than videos, and VidDevos and things that are on YouTube and all over the place. TikTok, short ones, short podcasts, except they want to do dancing. You make me feel like dancing. I'm going to dance the night away. But 50 years, I've had a chance to question everything. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get you inspired. I want to end this with, as far as the introduction is concerned. Let's see, it's been 37 minutes and 53 seconds. I want to inspire you with the idea that, hey, if you're a cynic, you're not any different than I am. And I'm saved. I'm bluntly, I'm a, trust me, if I wanted to go to school, I could pick up a master's degree in theology with all the studies that I've done in order to prove, disprove, or be a part of, and all the different religious aspects of all the different, throughout the centuries, what man has done in his theology. And, one of the master's degree premise that I would say is that I wanted to write a new, there's a book called, a series of books called Systematic Theology. It talks about the pragmatic way of dealing with how we examine God in theology. And I don't believe in it. I don't believe in systematic theology. I think systematic theology is backwards. I think it's man trying to find God and understand him. And my premise in writing a thesis would be to present a new format and a new series of massive volumes of systematic theology, simile, would be called, I have to think of the word now, integral specificity. And that's the name of my whole field and thesis on how we should be allowing God to speak to us as opposed to trying to prove God or prove, like in systematic theology, they have like God, and then they say, well, God is this, and then they puts then all the different outlines, whatever. No, I'm the opposite way. It's like, hey, no. And I do it in a way that not only presents it in the theological terms, but it presents it in the rap terms too. So on the one hand, integral specificity is the specific details of the integrity of what is already presented to us by God, speaking directly to the individual as he is specific to its integer that is required to understand that specific with where it is integrated to, which converted into rap is, it is what it is, where it is, the way it is. Now, what does both of those mean? Well, one's a rap, one's a trap, because, both of them are pretty accurate. But what it means is that because it requires the Holy Spirit, no man can understand things of the Spirit, for they are spiritually discerned. So it says, we need our mind to be opened up in some ways, or that unknown connections that aren't going on because we weren't really prepared for it, because we don't connect through the spirit to the soul to the physical body, but we connect from the physical body to the soul, and then if you're born again, to the spirit. And that connection between soul and spirit is kind of like, it's a gradual process that it takes time to develop those synapses, spiritual synapses, so to speak. It would be a different word, but those integers that are integrated within the tripartite of who we are, what we are, and how we were created to be in reality of our capability of receiving and understanding what we're being told by God. And then, if we did a thing on God, it would be God speaking. God say, I am that I am. Well, okay, that's what God is. He is that he is. And you leave it at that. What does that mean? Well, that's what it means, What do you mean that's what it means? That's what it means. It's simpler and it's more complicated at the same time, which is a paradox. And paradox is the basic premise of integral specificity that I conceive of. I don't think I'm the only one, but that I'm not bald. I just got my hair all wet, so I had to wipe it down because I jumped out of the shower. But integral specificity, I did a big, long write-up and did all kinds of studies and stuff on it. So that's why I say, well, yeah, I go after a master's degree, but why? That's just more, self-congratulatory, and building up ego as opposed to servitude, And there again is the same reality of how we don't project the correctness of our relationship that we're supposed to have. That should be the underlying theme of our theology, which would be the integral specificity. You have to, because the integer is like the integral specificity of the RNA nucleotide all the way down to the absolute microtide, going down there. If you look it up, you'll figure it out because you'll see it. It's in there, the word. Now, I used it in a way that nobody ever thought of using. Because it comes from DNA. Now this is our spirit, SNA, spiritual DNA, which is what it could be called. Integral specificity is your spiritual DNA. So that was from God, because God just wanted playing with me. We were talking and having a conversation, going through this, and I was going like, I don't agree with this, I don't agree with that. So he says, do it yourself. All right, I will. Waste of time, but in a way, it's not a waste of time, but it gives you the reality that in the same way that Judaism, how did they come up with the Talmud? One guy, think about this now, you got to remember this. One guy sat down and recorded everybody's, statements that they were verbally arguing. One man. Maimonides is what, you'd say in Western culture, So this rabbi, he just sits down and said, okay, I'll put it all together. Now he's, but the Talmud, one man? If one guy could do it, then how do we get, these other things? If it's one person, and you kind of go back into God and you start seeing, yeah, God does things like that. One individual could make the difference. Moses makes the difference. Jesus makes the difference. Abraham makes the difference. One, you make the difference. So that's what integral specificity is. Without one integer, it all falls apart, because if you took one out, the whole DNA come unraveled. Sort of. It would, but it'd take a while. So take one part of God out and it comes unraveled. And that's the problem, is that with systematic theology. They took parts out to try to understand it, but they didn't keep the comprehensive whole. So you in your life probably aren't conceiving of God as a overall big picture kind of item that might be operating with you and doing anyways things without a part of and involving you without you even knowing. Wow, imagine that. Be easier if you got it with a picture, then maybe you could come up with a better, result. And that's why you are an integer in the specificity of God. See, God created uniqueness in the very fact that you exist. That's unique. You aren't an animal and you aren't an evolution. Even if you were, you'd still be, even if you wanted to go to Christian evolution of some type, can't find anything, no missing links there. But even if you wanted to, you still couldn't solve the spiritual part and you couldn't solve the soulful part, because dogs don't have spirits, animals don't have spirits, people have spirits. Oh, there's a spirit of animal. No, there's not. That's the soul. Sorry. Yeah, you get a little weird there. You'll figure that one out. If you get into cults and stuff, you'll see. Well, these animal gods weren't really, they're deceptions. I gotcha. That makes sense. Perfect. Okay, because they're animistic, not supernal. See, animistic is the idea of the animal kingdom being involved into our perspective and being that we pattern things after the animal. Supernal means that we have laid ourselves above that and look at the heavenlies and look at the spiritual aspect of reality. Supernal, animistic, Jewish words, but Jewish culture words, but you'll see them that they're in theology, just ancient theology, but still, because they were trying to pattern themselves after Jews, Jewish culture and stuff. At least the Catholics were, or the early church was, and then later became Catholicism and all Protestantism and all that junk, which is a fascinating lesson in learning, even about modern churches today. It's like, why did the Jesus movement end? And it did. That was the end of the people want to talk about like prophecy and end times and blah, blah, blah. I lived in Israel, it's like, yeah, that was cool for a while, but I'm an American, so I really had to come back. You get pretty spoiled being in America. After you've been denied for a long time, you want back. So the perspective of a lot of our civilizations come from biases and prejudices and formatting ourselves into boxes and stereotypes that God doesn't want us to have, which is why it makes it harder for people to sometimes realize you don't need a church or you don't need a evangelistic crusade to get saved or to talk to God or to have an interaction. God is real, meaning that the sense of the person of who you are dealing with is not a pastor. It is not the person next to you. It is not some evangelist. It's not some preacher. It's not some teacher. It's not some religion. It is a one-on-one with the creator of the universe. Now, if he appears to you as something else, he's going to change that around the world, and gradually you're going to come around to find Jesus. It may take a while, like in C.S. Lewis's books, The Chronicles of Narnia. There's a guy in there that thought he was following some person. It turns out he's following somebody else. And then he says, it turned out to be Aslan. Which means that C.S. Lewis had the concept of the idea that you could be misunderstanding a lot and still wind up finding, first of all, salvation, but finding Jesus in the end. So if you have a problem with God, then go to Jesus. If you have a problem with Jesus, well, talk it out with him. If you have a problem with talking and thinking that you don't get an answer, hey, go out into a friggin' parking lot and start screaming at God. I did. That was after I had gotten saved, but still, I did it, and there were quite a few nights of parking lots that nothing happened. When it did, okay. Got that out of my system. It's like, okay. It's a little easier when you do it, still small voice, than screaming at God and expecting, if you believe it, if you're real, you'll strike me dead. And I never said anything like that. I was not that stupid, but, we can talk about, like in the Jesus movement, which we will in the podcast, the 50 years, things that are called coinkydink, coincidences, kismet, karma. A lot of people like to call it that, because nowadays they don't want to call it what it is. God taking and intervening, creating an intervention in a way that only could be explained as there is a supernatural being present and it is happening and occurring in this circumstance. Because how can you explain some things? And we'll get into them. I got lots of them. I got lots of them with other people, trying to explain to them, hey, look, here, flip open a Bible. I'll show you what the Jesus movement was like with the flip Bible. It's like people say, well, don't flip your Bible open and expect God to speak to you. Why not? It worked. In other words, if you're so, I don't want to say ignorant, but if you're so innocent that you don't have any other way to communicate with God, God will communicate through words. God will communicate through people. He did it through a donkey, so I guess he could do it through your Shih Tzu pooch. I don't like dogs. I had two dogs. I love my dogs, but I don't like people's dogs nowadays because they made them into gods, and children and doing weird crap with them. But God could speak through animals, in ways that, lead to eventually a relationship with him. And that would have to come about through the relationship that Jesus said, follow me, And Jesus said, hey, I will in no wise cast you out. I will hear you. I will speak to you. Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice and they know me. They will not follow the voice of another. Voice ain't reading. So if you got a word, and you're reading it, good. I'm happy for you. If you never heard God speak to you, pursue it. Go after it. I'm going to end that with this. Is that, yes, God speaks to me. Yes, God has spoken to me. It's not in my head. God does have a voice. God does speak audibly, or let's put it this way. God can speak audibly. God will speak audibly when he chooses to. You have to work with him to get him to talk to you, and you have to be willing to listen to what he has to say. You probably will come to some kind of conclusion that'll lead you one way or the other, because you'll either be hot or cold. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. You'll either be hot or cold, up or down, left or right, Because if you really push it that hard, you're going to come out of it going to heaven or going to hell. Literally. It just, that kind of realism, that kind of reality, God uses, but he also is very specific about it when he does. It's, a line drawn in the sand. He won't cross over it, that's a theology thing that, isn't true about God, but people say there is a line we know not where God won't promise he won't even cross over. That's like saying God won't create a bar he can't pick up, stupid statements that people make up about God. God is love, so because he loves you, he will come to a place where, yes, he will speak to you, and he'll send his son, and he'll send people around you and everything else, circumstances of life, everything to get you to a place where you can come to a intimacy and a relationship and a realization that, one, there is a God, and two, you're going to follow Jesus. If you choose to, you'll be saved. If you choose not to, you won't be. It'll be that simple. And you'll figure that one out by the end of your life, or the middle, or 50 years with Jesus. Which I'm looking forward to this introduction being done, because it's almost an hour now. And I'm looking forward to talking to you about the first one, podcast 1, which will be pretty much talking about my salvation experience. My early days in the Jesus movement, probably the first maybe only 48 hours. It was a pretty intense, maybe a little bit longer than that, but it was pretty intense. So we'll talk about, in the podcast 1, rather than 50, it'll be podcast 1. It'll be 50-1, VidDevo podcast. And it'll also be, the VidDevo 50, that you get a chance to see and hear from me my memory and recounting and retelling of what happened to me. This isn't like, I'm trying to convince you of anything. I don't care. If you do, great, far out. But if you think I'm trying to convince you of something, hell no. I can't convince you of anything. I've been married 3 times. I can convince you of how not to do some things and how to do other things. I can tell you what marriage is like. I can tell you a lot of stupid stuff, and some of it's wisdom, some of it's stupid, But I will relate the facts of it and the stupidity of it and the facts of, when people made mistakes like the Bible does. Bible records all these guys, screwing up, in the Old Testament. They show their life story. Not every detail of everything that they ever did that was wrong or right, but, certain highlights that God wanted us to understand and to see that we're not alone. We are like all other human beings that have ever existed throughout the ages. So this Easter, which is today for me, I pray and I hope and I ask that somehow you figure out, what it is that you really want to experience, and that you get to the place where you decide once and for all that you're going to eliminate this contradiction that you have in your life we call God. That you're going to, I'm not saying go to church. I don't care whether you go to church or not. Right now, I'm not going to church. My wife goes to church. My mother's dead. My wife goes to church, but, takes grandkids or children. But if I go to church, believe me, everybody wants to talk to me. It's like, I don't want to talk to you guys. Leave me alone. I'm old. Leave me alone. I want to go sit on my rocking chair, and rock. I'm kidding. Something like that. You'll hear about it in podcasts. But for now, all I want you to do is to deal with, your own person. You deal with you on a one-on-one with God. Get real. Quit faking it. Quit pretending. Quit lying to yourself. Get somehow the beginnings of a storyline that you can start getting, even writing down little notes if you have to prove to yourself God don't exist. Because in trying to prove God don't exist, man, you're going to prove he exists, all right. There's no problem about that. Then get to the place where you're going to challenge, yourself to listen and challenge God to speak. Because that's what it boils down to. It boils down to Jesus said, follow me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the Father but by me. So I'd like you to know God the Father. I mean, honestly, knowing Jesus is great. I hope you do. I hope you stick with him only. Be a disciple, be a Bible teacher, be a church person, whatever. But knowing the Father, that is a hair-raising experience. You could say that it's a raising the dead type of experience. I mean, if Jesus didn't raise himself from the dead, then which one do I want to know more? God the Father or Jesus? Hey, I like Jesus. He's a nice guy, brother. He's God. He's Son of God. Blah, blah. But if God rose him from the dead, I want to know the guy that's in charge. So I kind of got it, maybe a little prejudice, a little bias, but, I'll tell you all about Jesus too. Enjoy, I pray, this day that we call technically in 2024 Easter.